Well, hello and welcome to this edition of Wednesday Palaver. And Wednesday Palaver is actually sponsored by the Accra Collective of the Socialist Forum of Ghana. Now this week, we are taking a look at the observance of Africa Liberation Day. What does it mean? Why was it instituted? What's its impact? And so on. And we are particularly privileged today to have one of us, a member of the Accra Collective of the Socialist Movement of Ghana, Comrade Kwesi Adakwa, to lead us in this discussion. We're going to start off with his presentation, and then we're going to come to the studio audience for them to raise questions and raise questions and make comments. And then we'll go to our social media platforms and take comments and questions from there, and we'll come back to the studio for the concluding remarks of Comrade Adakwa. A round of applause for Comrade Adakwa as we welcome him to the microphone.
I'm sorry. Good evening, comrades. Good evening, listeners. Comrade Kwesi, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here, especially on behalf of the illustrious socialist movement, especially the Accra Collective. Also, we know that the various collectives across the country are working hard and also doing their best to learn how to prepare ourselves for the revolution that will liberate us. If you are not a member of the socialist movement, I urge you to find the nearest collective wherever you are and join. And I can tell you that it will really enhance and enrich your life. I, having been a member, I can attest to that. What I have learned within the past few years that I've been with the SMG, I can tell you it's changed my life. African Liberation Day, and I think we should emphasize the word Liberation Day. It falls on the 25th of May every year, and is marked across the continent. Well, there was a time that in this country it used to be a holiday. It's no more a holiday, so in a few days' time when we mark it, we will not mark it as a holiday, but we hope that the day will be brought back to its normal glory. I will start by saying that I will do my presentation by linking African liberation to the AU, which is the African Union, or formerly the OAU, and then also link it to Pan-Africanism. And by I'll begin by saying that African Union or African unity and dignity is the highest form of highest stage of Pan-Africanism. These three concepts, liberation, unity, and Pan-Africanism, they are linked. They are linked in the sense that if you are a Pan-African, you believe in African liberation, and if you are a Pan-African, you believe in African unity and dignity. So African liberation has its roots within the context of Pan-Africanism, and on the continent of Africa, the 25th of May was declared because when in 1963 we were able to put together what became the OAU, or which is now called the AU, the African Union, a committee of liberation was set aside. Initially it was called the Decolonization Committee, and what it should tell you was that at that point, even though many African countries were newly independent, there were two aspects. The first aspect was that other countries were still under open raw colonial oppression, and then there was also another form of colonization which is not very subtle. if you don't have the eyes and the ears, you will not see, you will not hear. And that is what Kwame Nkrumah gave us the theoretical grounding by calling it neo-colonialism, and which basically says that even though you now have the trappings of independence, you have a flag, you have national anthem, you may even have a currency, you have a president, you have politicians, you have a parliament, you have many trappings, but beneath all that are vestiges of domination by the people who used to rule you but have now been driven away, or they have left. They have left, but their roots are still deep in the soils of Africa, exploiting and also controlling what happens in our so I will start by just trying to discuss what Pan-Africanism because that is the roots of our unity, the roots of our unity that led us to seek for liberation and independence. So Pan-Africanism is more like an idea that talks about, it's a political idea, it's not a religious idea, it's not anything, but it's a political idea that talks about African solidarity, African liberation, and African independence, and also ultimately African dignity and unity. And when we talk about African, Kwame Nkrumah made a statement. He says, I am Africa because I'm African, not because I was born in Africa, but Africa was born in me. And this is a very profound statement that Kwame Nkrumah made. And if we want a true father of Pan-Africanism, is one of them, one of the giants of Pan-Africanism. And this statement is a very deep one, profound one, in that, number one, if he says Africa was born in me, it means that you can actually be in Africa, but if Africa is not born in you, you are not a Pan-Africanist. You may also not be in Africa, but if Africa is born in you, you will be called a Pan-African. And that is why the history of Pan-Africanism is actually traced all the way to the Caribbean, when our brothers and sisters were carried away into slavery, and over the years they came to seek to reconnect back to the continent. So they had a lot of different movements, and one of those movements was Pan-Africanism. And the Trinidadian intellectual, his name was Wallace, he brought about this idea of Pan-Africanism. But it didn't end there. Many others, including Marcus Garvey, back to African movement. And anytime you see us using the black star, that is the trademark of Marcus Garvey's enterprise. His idea was that all the people in the New World need to come back home in dignity and rebuild Africa. So he had this Return to Africa movement, and his symbol was a black star. So when you see the black star in our flag, that may be the basis. When you see that we used to have the Black Stars of Ghana, the football brand that has gone so high global, that is the meaning. The Black Star, we used to have a shipping line called the Black Star. We used to have many ships owned by the state of Ghana that were trading and carrying goods across the country, called the Black Star. That is the basis. But the point I want to make is that inspiration of the Black Star emanated in the diaspora. So in the African Union setting, we say the African Union has a sixth region, because African Union is organized in regional economic blocks, and the sixth region is a diaspora. We recognize as Africans that there is a link, a cultural, genetic link between us and our brothers and sisters living everywhere on the planet. And that link is a link that is not just based on just the skin color, but ideas. The idea of coming together and emancipating and liberating ourselves, not just from slavery, but also neo-colonialism and all forms of oppression that we suffer as a people. So Pan-Africanism is the founding intellectual logic for African liberation. And the African liberation movement also started in most individual African countries, but when the diasporans were thinking about unity and back home, they also saw that we were under oppression. So, as beautiful as it became, Africans and those from the Caribbean and those from the other Western nations came together to form what we call the Pan-African conferences or congresses. These Pan-African conferences, there were 3 of them. They were very significant in that they laid the groundwork for the subsequent ones, and also the intellectual basis for Pan-Africanism. But the 4th one, which happened outside Africa in Manchester, was one of the eponymous ones that brought together many people fighting for liberation and freedom and unity of Africans. And during that conference, a lot of the African intellectuals, including our own Kwame Nkrumah, C.R.L. James, Du Bois, and others, got together and they determined that we are not just going to fight for independence for individual African countries. We are going to liberate the whole of Africa together and unite Africa. So liberation, Pan-Africanism, and unity are intertwined. Every time we talk about African unity, African liberation, remember that these 3 concepts are intertwined. So from there, we move to the stage where African countries came back, began the fight for independence. And it is no accident that Ghana is now one of the makers of African unity and liberation. There's nothing that you can say or do about African unity and liberation without mentioning Ghana, even in contemporary times, as we seem to have lost our shine. But the basis was laid by our example. That example was the liberation struggle that was crystallized in Ghana that led to our independence in 1957. A significant event happened. For the very first time in the history of any nation or any group of people, the independence of one nation was declared to be linked with the total liberation of the whole continent within which that nation is situated. It's never happened. You never heard that when one European nation got independence, they declared that the rest of Europe should be independent. Or one other country in Asia got independence and they were. Maybe the closest one was what Bolivar did in South America, but that one is a different thing. But this one, they got independence and say, my independence is not complete. So that incomplete independence led to a push for a continental-wide liberation struggle. Now, that is why we mark the AU Day. The liberation struggle began that by 1958, Kwame Nkrumah brought together to give meaning to his statement, not just words. Because these days we have a lot of politicians who just speak words, a lot of people who speak words. He gave meaning to the words. And the meaning was that a year after independence, he brought together a lot of African intellectuals and freedom fighters and those wanting to liberate themselves into Ghana. Not just for them to be given the tools and the impetus and the encouragement, but also to network among themselves as liberation fighters to be able to liberate their individual countries and also bring the African continent together as one united and strong continent. So the role of Ghana's independence cannot be overemphasized in this connection. Then practically, our independence also brought meaning to some countries that were independent or fighting for independence but were being oppressed by the classic example is Ghana and Guinea. Guinea defied the Gaulle, the French, and they decided not to go along with the independence on a platter within the French system. He wanted the independence to be true independence, for them to have self-determination. And when the French got angry and stripped the country of everything that they had used within the country whilst they were colonizing the country, it was through an act of solidarity that Nkrumah extended to the other African country, which is Guinea, for them to be able to stay on their feet. So this is a demonstration of the dignity through solidarity that Pan-Africanism also embodies. Now, we will march a little forward and say, when in 1963, the AU was being formed, there was a lot of debate about how the AU should be formed, or the OAU. The OAU, as envisaged by some, saw the OAU not as just a collection of countries meeting to do conferences and meeting to deliberate on issues of concern. No. What some thought, spearheaded by Nkrumah, was that we needed to come together as one giant block of countries. And this didn't go down well with a lot of the imperial countries, who saw this as a direct threat to their dominance in world affairs and also over African resources and wealth. Now, so there had to be a compromise. It wasn't even a compromise, but it was basically a shattering of a dream. At that point, most of the other African countries, of course, some of them controlled by their puppets in the West, gave in and said, we need a watered down African OAU, Organization of African Unity, with heads of states and heads of government meeting to take decisions without any substantive integration or unity. So that was how this was done. And the task of liberation, as I said from the beginning, the task of liberation was given to the Decolonization Committee, which became the Liberation Committee in 1965. That Decolonization Committee set about a task towards organizing support for liberation struggle on the continent. I would say that after reading the literature, their results were mixed. But the lesson that I took from there, compared to in contrast with what happens with the current EU, the contrast was that in 1963, when the Decolonization Committee was formed, it had, number one, a vision and a goal. The vision was a decolonized Africa. The goal was to fight colonialism at every point and win. Now, the liberation movement also was backed by ideology. It wasn't just a wish for something to happen, but there was a logic behind it. What is the ideology that drove our leaders back then? I wouldn't say that it was a plain sailing. Not everybody agreed to that, but largely the dominant idea was that we liberate Africa. And the ideology behind it was largely socialist, because it is that kind of ideology that gives you the tools and the methods to be able to study and have discipline and long suffering to be able to struggle to gain your liberation. So the Decolonization Committee that morphed into the Liberation Committee continued its work, and I will say that, as I said, their results were mixed, but largely by 1970 a lot of African countries had been able to attain liberation, not just by the effort of a few others, but a continental-wide effort where liberation fighters across the continent were given support by various progressive governments, such as in Ghana and even in Tanzania and others. The apartheid regime had its biggest foes on the African continent. In fact, without the African continent providing the resources, providing the refuge for liberation fighters, that struggle would have turned a different way. So the liberation that we talk about is basically an African liberation struggle that was inspired by Pan-Africanism. Now, I will link to what we have as the transmigration of AU into AU. Now, as of today, if you ask me, what do I think about the AU? In fact, we shortened the OAU to AU, and we shortened its vision and its aspiration. And the people of Africa has lost a lot for this kind of transformation. And what I'll say is that the current AU is nothing like the OAU. Even as we try to criticize OAU, which there was a time it used to be called a talk shop, but it's nothing like that. The first flaw of the current AU is that it doesn't have any logical direction. It has basically been turned, the AU Commission has basically been turned into a bureaucratic organization. So the AU Commission has many commissioners. They have the health, economics, security, political, whatever. It's like, if you ask me, it's lost its logical orientation. So it's become a bureaucracy. And the power that used to be in the hands of the heads of governments has been transmitted to the bureaucrats. So the AU Commission chairman can basically take a lot of far-reaching decisions, even without the knowledge and the agreement of the heads of government, But the other thing is that because of this flaw, the vision for African liberation and African unity is being lost. What we have now is a word that they have coined called integration. So African integration. So they say, oh, you don't need to discuss neo-colonialism. You don't need to discuss imperialism. Rather, talk about how you can trade among each other or among the other people. How you can just have your technology being interoperable between Ghana and Nigeria. How you can just have a few things that are common to each other. So that logic of a logical cohesion is lost. And because of that, we are now just doing integration. At the same time, this AU, with its structure and its direction, is bankrolled by foreigners. Those who seek to oppress us are the ones bankrolling us. And there's a very key thing that happened because of that. Now, because it is the bureaucrats who budget and spend the budget, they have become powerful. So the bureaucrats can go and sit down and have an agreement with CDC and set up African CDC, African Center for Disease Control. And whoever is in charge of that commission, that bureaucrat, can determine a Pan-African-wide health policy and whatever policy related to health without any recourse to the heads of governments. And at the same time, it has nothing to do with our aspirations or our ideology. So we are integrating, but we are not uniting. So we were there, and then they said, oh, Kwame Nkrumah said we should have had one common market in 1963. So let's revive it. How do they revive it? They go to EU. The EU funds all the studies leading to AFTA. And AFTA is, in its intents and purposes, is basically a neoliberal creation that is basically aligning ourselves so that the Europeans and Americans and outsiders can easily trade amongst us or with us. So they will ask us to put ourselves together, not for ourselves, put ourselves together for them. In fact, Africa is one of the saddest cases when it comes to trade negotiations or economic negotiations. When we are negotiating as a bloc, they've created something we call ACP, the African Caribbean Pacific Group. That is the organ that negotiates on behalf of Africa. This one was put together by EU for them to be able to negotiate with these countries bunched together as one bloc without any African agency within the process. So the liberation that we fought for, we've given it away on a platter. When we want to even build railways and logistical connections amongst ourselves, they are conceived and planned and designed by foreigners. So just like Bridgesburg built a railway to the coast from the interior, the current situation is they will say Pan-African Highway. If you look at it, it's basically a highway designed by somebody for their own purposes. One of the biggest logistical projects going on in Africa right now is called the Lobito Corridor. It's straddling between Mozambique and ending at Angola, the Angolan coast. It's funded and controlled by the Americans. Basically, it is to ship resources across the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic coast so that they can just exploit our resources. In fact, one of the key planks of that is to, it goes through Democratic Republic of Congo. Basically now Congo has given away their minerals to Trump, and it seems like the die is cast. But I don't want to paint a picture of doom and gloom. There's more. I mean, there's more when it comes to security. The EU will call us, the Americans will call us and say, there's war in Somalia. Go and do peacekeeping. But behind it, they're just telling you that go and waste your men so that we can have a trade route in the Red Sea, between the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. Basically, that's where everything is for the interest of somebody. Everything that is African Union right now is basically designed by somebody else. So that liberation, we've given it away. And we've given it away because we lost the plot. We didn't pay attention to the ideology that drove it, and the idea about liberation and getting rid of neo-colonialism. So it is not lost, and I will expand this when I come back, but I just want you to know that there's some things that we can do. The first thing that I always say is that if you are Pan-African and you are very, 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 very passionate about African unity, dignity, and you are Pan-African, fight for power in your individual countries and rule those nations. Otherwise, the African Union will be taken over by people who have been sent on errand by their masters. Thank you very much. I'll end here and come back again.
Well, thank you very much, Comrade Adakwa, for the opening remarks. And now we want to move into the studio and to see whether the comrades in the studio have questions or comments to make. Anybody with a comment or question? I see one, two. Well, so the comrades can come in order, and then we'll go to the social media platforms.
Good evening, comrades. Well, comrade, thank you very much for that brilliant presentation. So he said, in a nutshell, what I pick from today's discussion is that Africans, we have given our liberation away. Why won't you give it away? We're in a country where we grow what we do not eat and we eat what we do not grow. Why won't you give it away? You see, the issue of Western imperialism and imperialist is something that, it's not good to write home about. And it's about time that, if for nothing at all, we learn from our neighbor, Burkina Faso, what this president is doing, President Touare. Okay, see, this Western imperialist, no matter what we do, they are in for exploitation, they are in for slavery. They work with the 3 B's. Bribe you, you don't take it, break you, or if you like, block you. If it doesn't work, they will come break you down. Do you understand? So today I'm very happy that we are discussing this topic. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah said, I'm an African, not because I was born in Africa. I'm an African because African was born in me. Do you understand? So, sometimes our culture, even the way we go about things, you see a black man and the way he or she talks is as if it's American. It's from, you see, all this thing must be a thing of the past. If we should take black people out of here to America or any other Western imperial land, and we should bring them here to still to be Africa. Do you understand? So if you see my big suit here, I would like to use that. I'm not being sarcastic, but I would like to use that. Africa, we have all the resources, just like my big suit, and we can do more. Congo, Ghana, Nigeria, not even to talk about the rest of the world. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here. Yeah.
Thank you, Comrade Akwa, for your presentation and a bit of history about the African liberation. Mine is just a question. What do you think the AU should do so that they can get back to their purpose, the purpose in which they were created? Thank you.
Well, I would like to invite Comrade Johnson to come with the messages and comments from social media.
Good evening, viewers. I'll be taking a few messages from our social media pages, our WhatsApp number, and maybe Facebook. So this Asante, he says, African Liberation Day is a powerful reminder of the struggles waged by our forebears against colonial domination. It should inspire a new generation of Pan-Africanists to continue the fight for economic liberation. The African Liberation Day means nothing if we don't reflect on the neo-colonial structures still holding us back. It's time we unite under socialist principles to take control of our resources and institutions. The spirit of Nkrumah and Sankara lives on. Once again from Asante. This is Linda Ofori. She says, African Liberation Day celebrates the bravery of those who fought for our independence and sovereignty. It's a day to recognize our progress and assess how far we've come in building strong institutions. Though we must never forget our history, our focus should now shift to innovation and economic growth. Let's honor the past by building a future rooted in discipline, entrepreneurship, and governance. This day should remind us that freedom must translate into development. This from Amma Boateng. She says, African Liberation Day highlights the importance of unity and resilience in the face of adversity. It's an opportunity to celebrate how far we've come as a continent. I believe true liberation now lies in building strong economies and empowering the private sector. We must channel this spirit into industrial growth, education, and better governance. The best tribute we can give is to build a prosperous Africa. That's what I get from Amma Boateng. This from Nana Mafrempong. She says, it's good that we have a day to remind ourselves of our African identity and past struggles. But it is also a day to reflect on our present responsibilities. We need to raise a new generation of hardworking, visionary Africans. African Liberation Day should encourage innovation, education, and self-belief. It's not just about looking back, but also moving forward. This is from Samuel Ado. He says, African Liberation Day should not be reduced to state events and speeches. It should be a rallying day for mobilizing young people around radical change. We must continue the legacy of our revolutionaries who believed in people over profit. Pan-African socialism must return to the center of our politics. True liberation is about transforming the system. This, I think, is a question. This is from Maxwell. He says, given the persistence of neocolonialism through debt, foreign military presence, and corporate extraction. How can African states use this day to advance a revolutionary agenda rooted in Pan-African socialism and economic sovereignty? I think that's a question. This is from Bedu. He says, African Liberation Day has lost its relevance in today's context. The continent continues to suffer from poor governance and internal conflicts. We should focus on solving today's challenges instead of celebrating past victories. Our youth are jobless and disillusioned. What use is a symbolic day without real progress? That's once again from Bedu. This from Owusu Otridania. He says, every year we talk about African Liberation Day, but corruption, tribalism, and poor leadership still dominates. It's become more of a ritual than a movement. True independence should mean strong institutions and economic freedom. Sadly, we are not there yet. Until then, this day rings a hollow. I think I'll take 2 more and I'll be done. This contribution. This person says, commemorating African Liberation Day without addressing the current economic environment of our people is a betrayal of the revolutionary spirit of Nkrumah, Sankara, and Cabral. Our continent remains rich in resources, yet poor in dignity, because capitalism and imperialism still shape our governance. This day must be used to organize the youth, workers, and farmers to demand a complete break from exploitative systems. Only through socialist transformation and continental solidarity can we achieve true liberation. The struggle is not over, it has merely changed form. I think I'll take one last one and I'll be done. This from Akosia Dankwan. She says, African Liberation Day gives us a sense of pride in our identity and heritage. It's a chance to reflect on our sovereignty and the responsibility that comes with it. I believe strong leadership and rule of law are key to honoring the spirit of liberation. Let's not waste the sacrifices of the past by allowing corruption and division today. Unity and discipline must guide us forward. I think this is where I'll end the reading, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Well, at this stage, we will be inviting Comrade Adakwa to give us his closing remarks of 5 minutes. Comrade Adakwa.
Thank you. I think the 2 questions from my comrade here and my other comrade who texted in, I think the struggle, as you say, is not a day struggle. I always, I'm a very big fan of history, just from a curious point of view, and one of the most interesting historical fact that I always use as an example is that we should count history in thousands of years, hundreds of years, not even decades. Of course, we want independence, we want development now, but we should also look at the bigger picture over thousands of years. And the example is from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal. It was occupied by the Moors. They built their empires, the Andalusia and all those things. And that whole place was occupied, and it was left with a small sliver of land at the northern part. And for 700 years, they waged a war of liberation until they liberated the whole of Spain. So we should also be determined for thousands of years, if that's what it takes to be able to liberate ourselves. But we should never lose focus of the vision. And the thing about ideology is very important, as you asked, because without ideological anchor, you will be all over the place, and that is why we are all over the place. So the point is, what is to be done? What is to be done, as I said, and some have also mentioned it, is number one, to fight to liberate our individual spaces, our countries. Because if we are talking about coming together as a Pan-African future, it will take the various countries coming together. And if those countries are not led by people who have those mindsets, it will not be difficult. It will not be easy. What is happening in the AES is bringing excitement to Africans because they can see from the past how it began. They saw conscious leaders who desired unity and decolonization. They had that idea. And those people come together and they are driving the imperialists out of the Sahara and the Sahel. So that is the first thing that has to be done. The second thing to be done is solidarity. In fact, solidarity is the currency of Pan-Africanism or currency of liberation. And we should give solidarity. And that's why I'm so happy that Africans all over the world are backing AES in solidarity against the imperial designs. So we need to have that solidarity. It is when we are able to have freedom and liberation that you are able to now sit down to even decide what is the best path for giving people jobs or developing. But if you are oppressed, you are working for somebody else. So we need the liberation first, and all of us may address our minds to that before we can develop our spaces. The British were here in Ghana for 100 years. Why did they leave behind? But they had a lot of wealth. We had the gold and everything. They were cutting it away. Why didn't they give Ghana the same level of? So it's a liberation that is first and foremost. And that liberation must be driven by ideology, and we should support with solidarity and our support. I will end by saying that I will quote Nkrumah. On 1st July 1960, he lighted a perpetual flame for African liberation. So the liberation monument there. And this is what he said. He says, day after day, year after year, this flame will reflect the burning desire of the African people to be free, totally free, independent, fettered by no shackles of any nature whatsoever, and will signify the ability to manage and direct their own affairs in their best interests of themselves. So that's what Kwame Nkrumah inspired us when he lit a flame. Let that flame burn in the hearts and minds of each and every one of us on this day that we will liberate, we celebrate the African Liberation Day on 25th of May this year. Thank you.
Well, it's time to draw the curtains on this edition of Wednesday Palaver. And we'd like to thank all of you, those of you who came into the studio, for coming and making this program possible. And we'd like to thank those of you who watched us from home, from your offices, on your mobile phones and so on, for being a part of this great program. Please keep joining us all the time, and those of you who want to come into the studio are free to come into the studio any Wednesday to participate in this program. On behalf of the producer of the show, Makiza Latifa, and the director of the show, Sarah, and all of us at Pan-African Television, is bye-bye until we meet you again next week. Bye-bye.